So we are continuing to talk about family conflict. And up to this point, we've talked primarily about conflict between the male and female parent in terms of who's going to provide parental care and how much parental care. Do you guys have any questions about any of that before we move on to the next thing?
Was that little table that we did yesterday and everything?
A little what?
The table, the sexual conflict one, like where they
Oh, yeah.
focus their no, not the other one.
Oh, the game theory, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, game theory stuff. Are there like any other factors that we'd have to consider in that? Or just like
No, so this was Maynard Smith's model.
Okay.
So the book talks about, there is the question of, where do these unmated females come from that the male can just go off and find and mate with? So there have been refinements of this over the years, but for the purposes of this class, I was going through this with Emily yesterday in our weekly meeting, and what I did in going through it with her, she kept wanting to look at the screen, and I'm like, get away from the screen, close your book. And so what I did with her was I said, okay, well, what matters for determining who's going to provide parental care and under what conditions? Just think about the three things that matter. The three things that matter is the probability of survival of the offspring under biparental care, monoparental care, or no parental care. The other thing, the second thing that matters is egg production, whether you are deserting versus egg production when you're carrying, and then the probability of a male finding a new mate, which of course varies somewhere between 0 and 1 in terms of probability. If these are the three things that matter, then it's easy enough to create the table yourself if you stop and think about what exactly is happening. So if we have the female carrying and the male carrying, there are payoffs to both the female and the male. Well, what would they be? Well, for the female, all that really matters is how many eggs being produced and which of these probabilities of survival are involved. So in this case, both of these individuals are carrying. So it's the smaller W, the number of eggs produced when she exerts parental care, multiplied times the probability of survival of those two parents. Probability of survival of the offspring, given that there are two parents carrying. And then this is the same thing for the male, because if the male is staying to care, he's not going off finding another mate anywhere. And so you can continue to do this for the rest of the table. You don't actually need the table in front of you to figure out what's in the table, because you're paying attention to these three drivers of parental care. Parental care, presumably, is being engaged in because it increases the probability of survival of the offspring, but it's costly, so that decreases the total number of offspring that you might have. But that doesn't really matter because you're increasing the survival of those by providing parental care, and it's costly to the male but not the female in that it might cost him future reproductive opportunities. So my advice for how to study this is to sit down without the table in front of you, try and recreate the table, and then recreate the conditions under which you would expect no parental care, biparental care, uniparental care by either the male or the female. And if you can reason through all of that without referring to the table, then you know everything you can possibly need to know about that particular idea. And so Emily and I worked through the whole thing without ever referring to the book, because we just got up what the three drivers were and then we thought through the rest of it. What else? What other questions do you have up to this point? All right. Then the next set of issues is dealing with the offspring. So Parents gain from providing parental care, but offspring also gain from from being cared for by parents. But ultimately, where the conflict arises is the idea of relatedness. So if you're looking genetically at parents and offspring, each parent has a 50% genetic relatedness to offspring if those offspring are the result of sexual reproduction. So when Paul was given rise to by Julia, his mother, and Jesus Christ, I'm really having a senior moment. My dad's name is Philip. His name is Philip John, and I'm like, Philip John, John Philip, John Philip, Philip John. He's been dead for a while, but that's bad form. I got half of my genes from my mom, and I got half of my genes from my dad. And so I'm related to my dad in that I only possess half of his genes. I'm related to my mom in that I only possess half of her genes. So my relatedness to my parents is half. But, of course, my relatedness to myself is what? My relatedness to myself is one. I have 100% of all the genes that I have. And so when we think about the relatedness between a parent and offspring, the offspring cares much more about its own situation than it cares about the situation of its parents. And similarly with offspring that are full sib offspring on average share 50% of their genetics with their siblings. And so once again, individuals should be much more concerned with their own welfare than they are with the welfare of their siblings. This sets up a conflict because a parent wants to care for offspring only to the degree to which it increases the fitness of the parent, because the offspring only possess half of their genes, whereas the offspring wants all of the parental care that they can get from the parents for themselves. And this works whether you have conflict within a brood or whether you have conflict across broods. The relatedness doesn't change simply because the temporal production of offspring changes. Current offspring are still only 50% related to future offspring, and all of the offspring are only 50% related to the parent. And so this sets up the conflict at its fundamental level. And so, as with all things, the benefits of parental care behave as if it's a diminishing return curve. A little bit of parental care at the beginning improves both the fitness gains of the parent and the fitness gains of the offspring, but there comes a point beyond which parents providing more parental care doesn't really gain the parent anything and doesn't really gain the offspring anything. There is always a cost to parental care, and that cost is oftentimes linear rather than a diminishing returns curve. And as a result of this, you can find where the maximum gain is for the parent and where the maximum benefit is to the offspring. And almost always, because the benefit to the offspring is going to be greater than the benefit to the parent, because oftentimes the benefit to the parent is just in terms of passing on copies of your genes, whereas the benefit to the offspring is actually survival. So as a result of the benefit to offspring being higher than the benefit to the parent of whatever the parental care is, you will almost always have the optimal solution for the parent is lower levels of investment in offspring than the optimal solution for the offspring. So offspring almost always want to be getting more parental care than the parent wants to provide, because the parent's benefits are maximal here, the offspring's benefits are maximal here. And so this is the nature of the conflict between parents and offspring. Offspring want more care than the parents are willing to give because of the shift in what's most beneficial to parents versus offspring. So that's the first fundamental thing. If you haven't yet felt this in your own family, you will feel it soon, more than likely. Um, but these kinds of things can also result in sibling rivalries. So we have Galapagos fur seals. Um, when times are good, there is rivalry between members of broods. But when food supplies are even are limiting, you find that the females produce less milk, the fur seal pups grow slower, and as a result, a older pup will still be around when the mother gives rise to the next pup. And so you have this older pup that has been feeding for a while off of the mother's milk and still wants to continue feeding on the mother's milk. And then you have this new pup coming along, and in some cases, maybe a year or two later, that also wants to compete for that milk supply. And so now you have this what we call interbrood rivalry. The first brood is competing with the second brood. And in almost all cases, it's the older, larger, further along in development pup that ends up surviving simply because it monopolizes access to the mother's milk, and then the other pup essentially starves to death. We also see a similar thing happening in the blue-footed booby, where once again there's time spans between when one egg is laid and the next egg is laid, and so there's this time during which the first blue-footed booby is getting 100% of the parental care. Then the second blue-footed booby chick hatches, and now there's competition. And once again, almost always the the sibling that comes along second is the one that gets the least amount of food and ends up dying, usually of starvation. This is what is known as facultative siblicide, and it's called facultative siblicide because siblicide is more common in this way when food resources are limited. When food resources are not limited, there's enough food to provide food resources to both of the offspring, but when food supplies are limited, there isn't. And so it's always the first sibling, the first child, the first offspring to come along is the one that gets the resources and the other one dies.
So it's kind of like a general definition for facultative suicide, basically like the older sibling
So siblicide is the
the younger sibling for the resources like more food.
yes. So siblicide, strictly defined, would be the death of one sibling due to the presence of another sibling. That could be actually direct in that. So, for example, the blue-footed booby could peck the head of the other one and kill it. But in most cases, it actually just dies from starvation because it's not getting enough food. So siblicide is just the death of one sibling because of the presence of another. It's facultative because it tends to occur more often when food is limiting, as opposed to obligate, which is it always happens. It's just a factor of the situation. So what this is due to is really just two siblings competing for the resource that is parental care coming from the parents. And so we can think about sibling rivalry through the lens of competition. So when you think of birds, you might think of birds begging. And once again, thinking about this whole relatedness issue, we know that about 40% of all birds that we kind of consider as monogamous, they engage in extra pair matings. So this is something that we studied back when we were talking about sexual selection. This is when you have a male and a female, and they are in love. That's a heart. That's a terrible looking heart. They're in love. They have a monogamous relationship, but this male then goes over and mates with this female, or this female goes over and mates with this male. Outside of that presumably monogamous relationship, that happens in 40% of all cases. We can measure paternity. We can measure the degree of extra pair matings because we can look at the paternity of offspring. And what we find is that when we look at the loudness of the begging. So when chicks are born in a bird nest, they start begging for food, and the way they beg for food is they chirp, 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 chirp. But they can control how much energy they put into this chirping because obviously those vocalizations require energy. And so you want to chirp as little as you can and as softly as you can to not only conserve energy, but also to avoid calling attention to yourself. And so what ornithologists have done is they look at the proportion of the young in a given brood that are due to extra pair matings. If you are the offspring of this coupling, any offspring that are produced by this female mating with this male are extra pair matings, and so we could do this in different colors in theory, where we make this male is this color. And so it could be that all of the offspring are going to be sired by this male, but it could also be that one or more of the offspring are actually sired by the other male. In this case, the relatedness between these two individuals is 0.5. The relatedness between these individuals and either of those individuals is 0. Sorry, not 0, 1/4. Sorry, 1/4, because they share half of their genes with these individuals because of the mother, but they share 0 of the genes of these individuals through the father because they have different fathers. And so there's essentially step siblings. As the proportion of offspring that are from extra pair matings goes up in families, they tend to compete with one another more for access to parental care. So if you measure how loud the chicks are begging, you see that when there's very little extra pair mating going on, decibels of begging are relatively low. The higher the proportion of extra pair matings, the louder the begging becomes, because presumably these unrelated individuals are competing more vigorously for the attentions of the parents as they go through this. The other thing that they find is that red as a mouth color. So baby birds will oftentimes have coloration on the inside lining of the mouth that induces a feeding response in the parents. Red is oftentimes more effective at eliciting this response. And so if you once again look at the percentage of a brood that is extra pair mating, you tend to find that red color dominates in those broods that have more extra pair mating going on. So the black line is for red and the dotted line is for yellow coloration. So relatedness ultimately matters in terms of how strenuous your competition is going to be with your siblings. If you're not related at all to your siblings, you're going to be more competitive than if you're related to them. This is another example of sibling rivalry from your textbook, but we also talked about this example when you were first year students. This is an American coot, and you can see that there is a different coloration pattern in the chicks relative to the adult coloration. This coloration goes away after these chicks grow out their adult flight feathers, and so this is clearly something that might be involved in parental care. There is some variation in coloration within a brood and also among broods. And these researchers basically were interested in what might be the evolutionary cause of this coloration in chicks. They ruled out camouflage because typically these bright colors make you more obvious rather than less obvious. And so they arrived on the idea that these offspring are competing for parental care, and they compete well for parental care when they are brightly colored, which attracts the attention of the parents. And so I don't know how much you guys remember of this, but do you guys remember what they did for the experiment to test this? don't remember. These are the babies. Um, the coloration on these feathers occurs out here on the tips of the feathers. And so one of the things that you can do as a researcher is you can just trim their feathers, trim off the orange part, and convert the babies from bright orange or red colored babies into darker headed babies. You can see that the base of the feathers is still black. It's just the tips that are colored. And so what they did was they did this and they created different groups of broods. One type of brood was a controlled brood where all of the chicks were orange and they just handled them as if they were going to trim them and then just didn't trim them. Another group was a group where everybody in the group was black. They handled them and trimmed them all off. And then they created a set of experimental broods where half of the babies were orange and half of the babies were black. And the hypothesis of the researchers was that this coloration is due to the evolution of parental favoritism, where essentially the parents favor those individuals within a brood that are more brightly colored. So why did they have a control brood that was all orange and a control brood that is all black?
Like a basis to see if they're the black ones are
Yeah, so the basis of favoritism is you have some individuals of your brood that you favor over others. Well, if everybody looks the same, then you're going to feed everybody equally. So it's a test of whether or not the parents are actually making comparisons within a brood, which they can do here, but they can't do here. If all of them are black, are they just going to neglect all of them because they're black? Or are they going to feed them all at the same rate because there's no difference among them? Same thing with the orange ones. Because they're all orange, they're going to feed all of them. And so then the question is there any difference between the feeding rate here and the feeding rate here? And is there any difference between the feeding rate of the orange ones within this brood versus the black ones within this brood? So they have two types of control broods. Control broods that are all orange and control broods that are all black. And then they have experimental broods where half of the brood is orange and half the brood is black. And they looked at feeding rate, growth rate, and survival. And what they found was that in all these cases, there was no difference between the control broods, but when there's a comparison, when the parents can look at a single brood and compare orange chicks to black chicks, they divided up their attentions and they gave more attention in terms of feeding to the orange chicks than they did to the black chicks. And so in order to give them more, they had to reduce the amount of feeding for the black ones. Same thing with the growth rate. The orange chicks had a higher growth rate than the black chicks, but only in the experimental broods. There was no difference in the orange broods. And once again, there were also slight differences in survival. So once again, we have an evolutionary response of these offspring such that the offspring have evolved a strategy in terms of a color pattern that manipulates the attention of the parent so that they receive, in this case, this is the feeding rate graph, but it's the same graph that we just looked at. This is just the graph from your book. So once again, another form of sibling rivalry competing for attention of the parents. And the parents have evolved a strategy of giving food to those individuals who are more brightly colored. So parents can manipulate the degree to which sibling rivalry occurs because obviously your fitness goes down if your siblings are, for example, killing one another because now you have fewer offspring than you had before. One of the ways that this happens is through asynchronous hatching in birds. And so this sets up a brood hierarchy. So This is really common in birds. Birds don't ever lay all of their eggs all at once, although reptiles do. And so this is, well, I've never actually used this comparison. One of the things that we find in birds is birds will lay an egg, wait a couple of days, lay another egg, wait a couple of days, lay an egg, wait a couple of days until they're finished laying their brood. Lizards and snakes lay all four of their eggs. What else is different between birds and lizards and snakes in terms of the things we're talking about in this chapter? Birds have biparental care in most cases. Well, I'm about to go back. This will be on the test. I hope this is in your list of review questions.
Oh, I remember.
Okay. All right. So let's pull up. What is it in the same one? Is it in the same thing? No, it's in this one. I didn't have to switch. Presentations. What do we find? When they have parental care, it's either the female alone or both parents, but what did I say about reptiles in general? And the same thing is largely true of amphibians as well. So this is the parental care that is provided when it is when it is found, but what generally is the situation with reptiles? They don't generally provide parental care. They dig a hole, they lay their eggs in the hole, and then they walk away from it. The females do. Knowing that there's no parental care here, and that there is parental care here, this makes sense. Why do birds tend to lay eggs this way? Well, for the first couple of days, this gets all the attention of the parents in terms of providing parental care. At this point, then, that attention is split in half. At this point, it is then split in thirds. And if something happens such that resources are limited or whatever else, they can just let this last bird languish and die. And so one of the things that they can do by laying eggs asynchronously is they kind of hedge their bets. I'm going to plan on producing this many offspring, but if I space them out this way, if it looks like the first three are going to survive and the fourth one would compromise the success of the first three, I can just let that fourth one perish to continue investing at 1/3 effort per offspring in the three that I already have. That's going to be different than if you lay all four of them all at once. Then all of a sudden you're going from providing no parental care to providing 1/4 parental care. And at 1/4 parental care, it may be that none of them actually survive. And so it allows the parent to make the decision about who is going to survive and how many will survive. So when we look at species where there's synchronous hatching versus asynchronous hatching, under good food supply, synchronous hatching does slightly better than asynchronous hatching, but when you look at situations where there's poor food supply, asynchronous hatching actually results in more of the offspring surviving. And so it's because if there's poor food supply and you hatch all four eggs all at once, like this, and there's not enough food to supply all of them, more of them die as a result of that. Whereas under poor supply here, you feed two of them, then you feed a third, and you can just basically kiss that last one goodbye. So brood reduction is easier when you're doing asynchronous hatching. And as a result of brood reduction, you end up getting higher overall reproductive rates. Oh gosh, haplodiploidy. So here's another form of parent-offspring conflict that is definitely related to genetic relatedness. Do you guys remember from your genetics class? I hope they covered this in genetics class. Do you guys remember what haplodiploidy is? Where it's found? What organisms it's found in? It's found in the social insects, found most commonly in the Hymenoptera, which are bees and wasps. Do you guys remember anything about the social castes of bees and wasps? You generally have a queen, and then you have workers, and then you have drones. What is the ploidy of workers and drones, and what's the sex of workers and drones? So the queen is obviously female. What are all the workers? They're not male. They're all female. These are all daughters. And the drones are males, and the drones are only produced for the purposes of reproduction. The haploid males, so these guys are haploid. The haploid males come from unfertilized eggs. So they share 100% of their genes come from the mother. But only half of her genes are in there. So relatedness is variable from the standpoint of whether you're thinking about the drones themselves or the mother. The queen has 0.5 relatedness because half of her genome is in the offspring. But also, because the queen produces workers from fertilized eggs, they are diploid. The queen also shares 50% relatedness with the workers. So the queen is equally related to workers and drones. However, when you look at workers versus drones, daughters share 75% of their relatedness, while they only share 25% relatedness with their brothers. And so there's a conflict between the daughters and the queen as to what they want the queen to be producing. So you have daughters who want the queen to be producing more what? In terms of relatedness, what benefits you more as a daughter? To produce more brothers, or what is that? What is THRI? Oh, I know. It's their, THEIR. Who are the daughters more related to? Brothers or sisters? Yeah, they're more related to sisters. So the daughters of the queen would want the queen to be producing more daughters because that produces more of who they're related to. Of course, there comes a point in the life cycle of a hive when the queen wants to be doing what? Producing sons, because when they produce sons, they have someone to mate with. And so this conflict arises between what the daughters want the queen to be doing and what the queen wants to be doing, depending on where in the life cycle of of the hive is. And so you would generally expect there to be 3 times as many daughters as there are brothers on average because of this difference in relatedness. Um, and so that's the benefit. That's the ratio that benefits daughters most. But that is not the benefit that benefits. That is not the ratio, rather, that benefits the queen as much, which would want more of a 50-50 mix of daughters and sons. And so that's another form of parent-offspring conflict, which is a conflict over what kinds of offspring the queen is producing. Then there's this other issue that your book talks about called genomic imprinting. And this is where these are gene expression changes. And so we've talked a little bit about gene expression. Remember that you can have variation that leads to differences in phenotypes because of allelic variation. You either possess an allele that gives you one manifestation of a trait, or a different allele that gives you a different manifestation of that trait. Tongue rolling is one of these things. If you can do this with your tongue, it means you have a dominant allele. If you can't do that with your tongue, it's because you possess a recessive allele. But that's not the only way in which phenotypes get affected. Phenotypes also get affected by variation in gene expression, because either there's allelic variation in a promoter region that controls a gene, or there are expression changes that are due to environmental causes. So genomic imprinting occurs when gene expression is influenced by which parent contributed the particular allelic variant of a gene. And so there's this gene IGF2. It's expressed only when it's inherited from the father. And so this is a gene that affects size, such that if you inactivate this gene, you produce smaller offspring relative to when this gene is activated. And there's another gene, IGF2R, which is expressed when it's inherited from the mother. And the gene produced by the mother is essentially a regulatory gene, and it regulates things by basically breaking down the protein that is produced by IGF2. So when IGF2 is inherited by the father, it reduces the size of the offspring, but when it's inherited from the mother, it essentially when this gene is expressed by the mother, is inherited from the mother, it expresses itself such that it destroys the product of this thing. So we have these two genes which basically affect the size of offspring. And these two genes are in conflict between the two parents. Gene inherited from the father makes offspring smaller. Another gene that, when it's inherited from the mother, increases the size of the offspring by basically breaking down. Sorry. This makes, sorry, this gene product, let's write this on the board, easier to talk about when we can write it down. Getting turned around in my head. IGF2 produces a gene product that increases size so that if you inactivate it, size decreases. IGF2R produces a product that breaks down IGF2. When IGF2 is broken down, then size decreases because IGF2 increases size. When you inactivate this, it doesn't break down IGF2. And so size goes up. Okay. So regardless, you have these two genes that are antagonistic in terms of their action, and they express themselves depending upon which of the two parents, the mother or the father, actually the offspring inherit the gene from. And so you have a situation in which offspring, of course, would want to be getting IGF-2 from their father because that would make them bigger. And we have a situation where offspring would want to um, reduce the probability of inheriting this from their mother. And so you have these two genes that act antagonistically, and the expression is determined by whether it's inherited by the mother or the father, which represents some sort of conflict between the mother and the father in terms of the outcome for the offspring. Which is weird. This is a very unusual thing. There aren't very many situations where something like this is known, but my guess is that there's probably a lot of more of this genetic control that's going on in the background that we just don't know about because we haven't ever really had the opportunity and the technology to study these kinds of things in behavior. So when we think about conflict between parents and offspring, we are oftentimes thinking about offspring trying to coerce parents to provide parental care, and parents not wanting to provide that parental care because parental care is costly. And we get back to this figure here. Offspring want more parental care than parents are really willing to give because the benefits to offspring are different from the benefits to parents. And so how does this kind of get worked out over time, evolutionarily within a population? If the method of coercion that is employed by offspring is costly, that will tend to increase the cost line to offspring. So this is assuming that cost to parents or offspring are the same, but that doesn't have to be the case. It could be that in order for an offspring to get more parental investment, their cost curve is more like that, in which case, if this is the cost curve to offspring of coercing parental investment, the optimum is now no longer here. The optimum is actually back here somewhere, much closer to the parental care that parents are willing to do. And so the nature of the cost curve as well as the nature of the benefit curve really do matter in terms of mediating how much parental care parents are going to give and how much parental care offspring want. Because something like begging behavior, which requires vocalizations and activity from the offspring if you're a baby chick, one of the things we know about bird vocalizations as well as frog vocalizations in general is that vocalizations are generally very expensive to produce. As a result of that, that incurs a cost, which then makes the begging behavior less beneficial because that cost eats into whatever the benefit is. And so you can study this by actually manipulating how often begging occurs, how long it occurs, et cetera, et cetera. And so some researchers found that begging varied by nest of origin. And if the more you beg, the more the parents provision you. And so you can then basically take chicks from one nest and put them in another nest and essentially see if that begging behavior then results in any change in the new mother's behavior, the new parent's behavior. And so offspring of generous mothers generally demanded more, and that was something that was presumably ingrained in those babies when they were with the original mothers, and they kept that behavior up as you move them from one nest to another. So once again, begging calling attention intensity versus parental response. The more you beg, the more food that you get. Um, and as it turns out, when you look at level of offspring begging when with a foster mother, so if you are from one nest and you're put in the nest of another and you keep begging, you tend to once again get more parental investment from that mother when you're moved to that new nest. And so it really, the parent can't tell whose offspring are whose if they've been switched around by a bunch of researchers. They're simply responding to the begging behavior. Oh my gosh, and an example that I didn't brush up on before I came to class today. So I think we're just going to skip that last thing. Yeah, let's skip that last thing. We just won't cover the last two figures. Family conflict. Conflict between parents is generally over who's going to care and how much they're going to care. There is conflict between parents and offspring, once again, in terms of how much care the parents will give relative to how much care the offspring want the parents to give. And then there's conflict between siblings, but that's more of a conflict that is over competition for access to the parental care that is being given. And within those three kind of different silos, you can begin to think of what all the possibilities are of how these things play out over evolutionary time. Questions? The chapters that we have covered so far for this exam was the end of the competition chapter um, that dealt really a lot, mostly in terms of competition for mates. All of the sexual selection chapter and all of the parental care / family conflict chapter. The nice thing about the sexual selection chapter and the family conflict chapter is that many of the ideas are similar between them. You're always thinking about investment. And so think about investment in reproduction in the sexual selection chapter, where you have females that begin the reproductive process with heavier investments in reproduction than males do. That sets up this whole cascading series of effects that lead to sexual selection. But then when we get to the parental care and family conflict chapter, once again, it's all about investment. In this case, it's a question of who's investing in the offspring and how levels of investment vary between males and females, and then conflicts between the recipients of that investment and the providers of that investment. So a lot of the last two chapters has really been about how animals invest their time and energy. Females, from a sexual selection standpoint, tend to invest their time in making sure that the offspring that they have are going to be successful, whereas males tend to invest their time and effort in mating with as many females as they can. Once again, because of the initial investment in gametes at the beginning of all of this. Even in situations where things like fishes exert parental care by the males, once again, in many cases, that's largely due to the fact that, once again, that benefits that male in terms of not so much the survival of the offspring, but as much as controlling paternity and, in some cases, actually increasing the number of mates that he gets. And so things that we covered in the sexual selection chapter bleed over into the parental care chapter. And the things that we've covered in both of these chapters will bleed over into the next chapter that is about mating systems. And then Elizabeth will be very happy that we're at the mating system section. Oh, great. I'm so glad. There was talk in the car yesterday about pushing back the deadline for the literature review. Is that something you want to do or something you don't want to do? It is neutral as far as I'm concerned.
I think it helps since we have an exam coming up. It's like a lot of the
Okay. Okay. You want to just make it due the following Thursday then? Okay. I don't want to put it off until the very end because then you're going to have a lab report butting up against the literature review. My experience with things that you put off is then things just kind of snowball, and then at the end of the semester you feel crushed. I don't want you guys to feel crushed at the end of the semester, but if it would benefit you, focus more on getting ready for the exam on Monday rather than working on your literature review for Thursday, then I'm fine with that. Okay. Week extension done. That's a reasonable kind of request. When I set things out, I wasn't thinking about how things fell relative to exams versus assignments outside of exams and things like that. But the literature that we read for this was sexual selection literature, McClintock and Hewitt, so expect questions on that paper as well. Hopefully that will be a fairly easy set of questions to answer because that was a pretty relatively easy paper to understand, I think.
That's one thing we've read, right? External papers.
What's that?
It's the only one we've read. Like,
Yeah, that's the only one we've read. Generally, I have one of those per test.
So you're going to be questions on, I should know all the questions on the secondary one, or look at final?
Only in how it applies to what their findings were in the first one. The only reason I included that second one was so we could look at the phylogeny, really, which is why I didn't have you read it as much as look at the phylogeny in it. Because a lot of that paper is really just about generating the phylogeny. The only reason I wanted you to have access to it was so you could see the phylogeny that got generated out of it. You're going to send an aid to your fellow students? That's super nice of you. You are so kind. All right, then I will see you guys on Monday. Feel free to email me over the weekend if you have questions. I will be around. And enjoy this wonderful weather we're having. I was talking to Avery at the beginning before the other two of you got here. I'm like, aren't you glad that we're not putting out models today?
Did you see the weather for next week?
I did not. Well, it is going to be better between now and then.
It's going to be better.
Starting Sunday.
Yeah, it starts like Tuesday, and then it's the high for Thursday.
Yeah. Well, of course, because it's Thursday.
Yeah. At least we don't have snow.
You can't be sick on Thursday. We need help pulling in the models.